Good morning. My name is Chris Murphy. I'm the Vice President for Government Relations and Community Engagement at Georgetown University. And on behalf of Georgetown, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today through this virtual format to engage in this timely discussion about eviction in DC. Today's event is one of a series of convenings Georgetown has hosted over the past several years through our DC Public Policy Initiative, a program that connects Georgetown's world-class researchers with pressing DC public policy issues and policymakers, and advances practical real-world solutions and strategies. Past events have explored diverse topics ranging from disparities in health, income, housing, and job readiness for DC African Americans, the effectiveness of DC public schools, human capital reforms, labor practices for DC Uber and other rideshare drivers, and how well the district has implemented its law making driver's licenses available to undocumented residents. Now, the benefit of today's virtual gathering is that it is our largest convening ever, with more than 400 people listening in and joining the conversation about the looming eviction crisis in DC and what can be done about it. We're really glad that you're joining us. Now, in just a moment, you will hear a presentation by Georgetown professors Brian McCabe and Eva Rosen on the findings of their recently released report on evictions in DC. And although their research and data analysis is focused on the pre-COVID-19 years, the ramifications of the pandemic have given the report and its recommendation a new urgency and significance. Following their presentation, we will hear from a diverse panel of experts moderated by Adrienne Todman. Adrienne serves as the CEO of the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials, but many of us know her best from her time leading the DC Housing Authority between 2009 and 2017, where she created a national award-winning model to house homeless veterans, increased home ownership, and expanded the number of affordable units in the district. We're grateful to Adrienne for agreeing to facilitate this important conversation, and we look forward to hearing what the panel, DC leaders from government, the private sector, and the advocacy community have to say. And then towards the end of the hour, we'll take your questions, so please feel free to put them in the Q&A box at any point. But first, we are delighted to have with us the chairman of the Council of the District of Columbia, Phil Mendelson, who's going to offer some brief welcoming remarks. Chairman Mendelson has been a longtime friend of Georgetown, but more importantly, he's a thoughtful champion and partner on progressive policies aimed at helping DC's most vulnerable residents in a sustainable and equitable way. He's been extraordinarily concerned about the looming eviction crisis in DC, and we're very appreciative that just a few weeks ago, he led the council to already adopt several of the recommendations contained in the report that you're going to hear about today. Chairman Mendelson, thank you for being here, and even more so, thank you for attention to this important issue facing so many DC residents. Let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for this opportunity. Again, I'm Phil Mendelson. I'm chairman of the council, and even though I'm going to go through some remarks, I want to, at the outset, thank especially Brian McCabe and Eva Rosen, because their work has been very helpful. As chairman, one of my key priorities has been to ensure safe, stable, and sustainable housing for the district's most vulnerable residents. The impact of COVID has forced DC into a state of emergency, and my focus, council's focus, has shifted to how we can provide direct interventions through immediate assistance and relief to those who've been most affected. We began this in March, if you can remember, and since then there have been roughly a dozen council meetings, many of which have been focused almost entirely on what we could do in reaction to the pandemic and the collateral economic crisis to try to stem the economic impact. My colleagues and I have implemented an eviction moratorium. We've banned eviction notices. We have mandated payment plan negotiations between landlords and tenants. We have, through the budget, almost doubled the district's emergency rental assistance payment dollars. It's now roughly $14 million. And that's just local dollars, not including federal dollars that are available for tenant rental assistance. I'm pleased that we've been able to take these actions, but so much of what we've been doing has been in a vacuum of data, where we're sort of guessing our way through what would be the most effective, efficient way of helping vulnerable residents and not creating collateral problems. So part of my approach has been to convene a small group of stakeholders to look at proactive policy solutions and grounded in data to the extent that we could or can or have. And that's where I connected with Professors Brian McCabe and Eva Rosen. And I got a preliminary look at their eviction study and recommendations that they were suggesting. We'll see today how they've refined all that, but I have to say that the professor's report has been very helpful to the district. As Chris alluded to, we've already adopted emergency legislation at our October 6th meeting. We adopted emergency legislation. Emergency means it goes into effect as soon as the mayor signs it, but it only lasts for 90 days, doesn't go to the Congress for a layover. And that legislation that we've adopted requires Superior Court to seal certain eviction records, prohibits a housing provider from filing an eviction for non-payment of rent if the amount owed is less than $600, prohibits a tenant from being evicted where a housing provider does not have a current business license, prohibits a housing provider from requesting information of a prospective tenant at the time of a tenant applying for a rental unit, requesting information that did not result in a eviction or judgment in favor of possession. Let me see, that's more than 3 years old, and requires a housing provider to provide written notice to prospective tenant of the housing provider's basis for taking adverse action, meaning not deciding to rent to the tenant, and also expressing, because we cannot amend the court's rules, so the best we could do is to the council formally vote to express our sense that the Superior Court has to raise the filing fees, which right now are the lowest in the country, while we have the highest number of eviction filings, I believe, in the country, at least on a per capita basis. So I can't say that we have solved the problems, not at all. But I'm hopeful that we are setting a precedent for the district to partner with higher education and engage in data-driven policy development with a common goal of serving our district neighbors in crisis and making the district a better model for service delivery. And with that, I think I've talked longer than I should have for welcoming remarks, but I appreciate everyone for listening and for giving me this opportunity, and look forward to the more formal presentation of this study. So thank you again.
Thank you, Chairman Mendelson, for being with us today. I want to begin by thanking Chris, his colleague Heidi, and the Office of Community Engagement at Georgetown for putting together today's event. Chris and Heidi have been really terrific partners from the earliest stages of this research, and Eva and I are very, very grateful for their commitment to getting our research in front of policymakers. We'd also like to thank the Meyer Foundation and the Georgetown Provost Office for their support of this research. And finally, before I get started, to thank our terrific group of panelists who have read our findings and agreed to participate in conversations about our findings and their implications for the district. So our goal with this report is to present data on the eviction process in DC. As you'll see, we draw on data from the court system to provide an in-depth portrait of housing insecurity in the city. We hope this report will continue to contribute to conversations about how the eviction process works and how public policy can improve. As Chris mentioned, I just want to acknowledge that our data come from before COVID, and so we won't address the impact of COVID in the report today. However, during the Q&A, we're happy to talk about some of the implications. So a body of research identifies the negative impact of eviction on renters, and especially on low-income renters in communities of color. The eviction process and the threat of housing instability impact the mental health and education outcomes for renters. Appearing in court requires tenants to take time away from other work and family obligations. When landlords pass along court fees to tenants, it increases the financial burdens that these families already face. And records of eviction filings and executed evictions prevent tenants from finding housing in the future. So drivers of eviction low-income renters, rising rents relative to income, especially in high-cost and rapidly gentrifying cities like Washington, D.C., the lack of rental assistance for most eligible households, and the limited supply of affordable housing. Now, critically, we know from previous research with landlords that many landlords file for eviction in order to get tenants to pay, not actually to evict them, right? An actual eviction, removing somebody from their home, is quite costly for landlords. So they tend to avoid this as much as possible, instead relying on eviction filings to put some legal pressure behind their rent collection. As a result, eviction filings are much more common in the lives of low-income renters than actual evictions. And the vast majority of eviction filings don't result in a tenant being removed from their house. In fact, cases are regularly dismissed because tenants pay the rent that was owed. Other cases are dropped by the landlord after the suit is filed. But what we want to show is that these eviction filings matter for tenants regardless of whether or not they're removed from their homes. So the data for our report come from two sources. First, we received a full set of eviction filings from the DC court system. These records account for more than 160,000 eviction filings over a 5-year period in the district, including every event that took place during the life of a case. To capture information that was not included in these records, including information about the subsidy status of a tenant or the amount of rent that they owed, we then collected and coded more than 14,000 forms that were pulled from the court website with a team of research assistants. So the eviction process in DC impacts a large number of renters every year. Landlords file about 32,000 residential eviction notices annually with the court. And we find that about 11% of renters in DC, or 1 out of every 9 renter households, received at least one eviction filing in 2018. Many of them, as we'll show in our report, received more than one filing in a calendar year. About 93% of these filings are filed for non-payment of rent. The fact that most DC cases are filed for non-payment of rent underscores the enormous financial challenges that rent-burdened households face in our city. About half of all renters in the district spend more than 30% of their income on rent, and about a quarter spend more than 50%. Although rental subsidies are intended to decrease the burden of rental costs and to lower the risk of housing instability, we find that many renters receiving subsidies still end up with an eviction notice. In fact, nearly 1/4 of all eviction filings are for tenants who have received a rental subsidy. And finally, by comparing the rates in our city to those in other places, we find that the rate of eviction filings, right, the number of eviction notices filed as a share of renters, is among the highest in the country. So one of the most important takeaway messages from our research is that most eviction filings do not end in executed evictions. So this graph identifies the number of evictions filed with the court every year. Between 2014 and 2018, we see only a modest change in the number of eviction filings. Notably, the chart also shows that only a portion of cases that are filed with the court actually end in an executed eviction. So the slim blue sliver at the bottom of each bar is the number of cases that end with an executed eviction where the tenant is removed from their home. The remaining green portion of the bar identifies the number of cases with another outcome, most often a dismissal. So among the evictions filed in 2018, only about 5.5%, or about 1,700 cases, ultimately ended in an executed eviction. This translates to about 1 out of every 100 renter households in Washington, D.C. being put out of their home through a court-ordered eviction. Notably, many other tenants are removed informally, or they leave their home before the writ is executed. And this happens in ways that we cannot capture with our data. Among renters who received an eviction filing in 2018, many of them, nearly 60%, received multiple filings between 2014 and 2018. So this process of landlords filing eviction notices over and over again against a single household at the same address is known as serial eviction filings. Now, this tells us something really important. When tenants receive multiple filings a year from the same landlord at the same address, it means that the landlords are not using filing as a way to evict. Instead, landlords are using the filing process as a tactic to put legal pressure on tenants to pay their rent or to leave. The challenge is that this overburdens our court system with cases where the tenant was never going to get evicted. Often, the tenant just needs a little more time to come up with rent money. This practice needlessly drags tenants to court. It causes them to miss work and family obligations. It also reduces the capacity of the court system to arbitrate real landlord-tenant disputes because they're flooded with cases that aren't going anywhere. Our research also reveals stark geographic variation in the pattern of eviction filings across Washington, D.C. 60% of all filings take place in wards 7 and 8, where the vast majority of residents are people of color and where the poverty rate is among the highest in the city. As you can see from this graph, the share of renter households receiving a filing in wards 2 and 3 is dramatically lower than the share of households receiving a filing in wards 7 and 8. In fact, in Ward 8, 1 out of every 4 renter households received an eviction filing in 2018. Even within these wards, though, we find that there are eviction hotspots located within a couple neighborhoods. This map shows the share of households in a census tract that received at least 1 eviction filing in 2018. In the neighborhoods with the highest concentration of filings, those that are the darkest green on this map, upwards of 40% of renter households were impacted by the eviction process. Additionally, by showing this map alongside a map of the racial composition that identifies the share of Black residents in a neighborhood, you can see how eviction filings are related to racial segregation in the district. And I should note too, before I turn this over to Eva, that the pattern here is largely the same, both across wards and across neighborhoods, when we look at executed evictions rather than eviction filings.
Thanks so much, Brian. So when tenants are summoned to court, they often owe small sums of money to their landlords, on average about $1,200 at the time that the eviction suit is filed. And we find that 12% of renters summoned to court in the district owe less than $600. Also, nearly 2/3 of households owe less than the citywide median rent, which is $1,487 when they're summoned to court. The fact that many tenants owe small sums of money when they're summoned has important implications for how the city distributes rental assistance programs, such as the ERAP program, which we'll talk more about at the end. We also want to note that following this analysis, as Chairman Mendelson mentioned, the City Council recently added a measure banning evictions for small sums of money. While tenants typically owe, again, about $1,200 when they're first summoned to court, this amount grows by the time a tenant is evicted. And by that point, the median renter owes over $2,200, nearly twice the amount that they owed at the beginning of the process. This is because by the time eviction filing works its way through the court system, tenants are even more in debt due to a combination of court fees and rent withheld. Now, while there were 31,000 eviction filings in 2018, we find that these filings were disproportionately concentrated in the hands of a small number of landlords. So if you look at the darkest blue stripe at the bottom, you'll see the concentration of eviction filings among the 10 landlords with the most eviction filings in 2018. And these 10 landlords filed 37% of all eviction filings in the city. Correspondingly, on the right, the bars show the share of residential units owned by these same 10 landlords. So looking again at that dark blue bottom line, these same 10 landlords who filed 30% of all filings actually own only about 16% of all residential units in the city. Similarly, the next bar up, excuse me, the top 20 landlords were responsible for nearly half of all filings, but owned only 21% of the total units. In other words, the largest landlords in the city are filing disproportionately relative to the number of units that they own. Now, in part, this is due to the fact that landlords who rent to lower income tenants may need to evict more frequently as they provide housing to the tenants who are having trouble paying their rent. However, we also ran this analysis looking just within wards 7 and 8, where renters are lower income than in other parts of the city. And here too, we find that larger landlords tend to file for eviction disproportionately to the properties they own and at much higher rates than smaller landlords. This is in line with previous research on landlords suggesting that larger landlords file on their tenants immediately after rent is due, submitting bulk filings for every unit where the rent is owed, often before reaching out to the tenant directly to find out what's going on, why rent is late, when they can expect it. While landlords, of course, are completely within their right to ask for rent owed, this analysis really points to an over-reliance on the court system in cases where an informal conversation might do a lot to keep tenants out of the courtroom and to keep their names out of the eviction record system, especially in cases where the rent is coming, it's just late. We also know that during the pandemic, landlords are using this tactic to pressure tenants to leave on their own rather than go through the formal eviction process. Now, research shows that having legal representation benefits both landlords and tenants. Even in straightforward cases where a tenant owes the rent, which is a majority of cases, having a lawyer can help ensure a fair process for everyone. For example, sometimes tenants withhold rent when there are quality concerns, and having legal counsel can ensure that tenants' counterclaims are properly heard. Our analysis shows that nearly all landlords are represented by a lawyer. In contrast, very few tenants have representation. Our findings show that tenants arrived in court represented by an attorney in less than 2% of cases. In an additional 1 to 3% of cases, a tenant may get day of legal representation through the Tenant Resource Center for their case. Now, here we plotted the filing fees for the 50 largest cities in the US. And it's clear that DC is a bit of an outlier here. You'll see DC on the upper left. It has the lowest filing fee and one of the higher filing rates. We see a strong correlation between the cost of filing for an eviction and the rate of eviction filings. So where it's more expensive to file for eviction, landlords file at lower rates. Where it's less expensive to file for evictions, they tend to file at much higher rates. In this way, the institutional practices of the court appear to be related to how many eviction filings are made against tenants. And the week before last, as we heard, the DC City Council implemented an emergency bill to recommend that the courts raise the filing fee from $15 to $100, in line with the median filing fee in other large US cities. As this recommendation is fine-tuned, we want to make sure that this fee is not passed along to tenants. Now, there are a range of policy approaches that we can think about when it comes to eviction, ranging from preventative solutions to Band-Aid solutions to more systemic approaches. And we really want to emphasize the complicated nature of the problems around eviction. This is neither a simple story of tenants nor one of just landlords. To this end, we're really happy to be able to bring this nuanced data to the question and really eager to pass it along to this panel of experts to begin a conversation around next steps for our city. But before we do that, I just want to highlight a couple of the big policy implications that we think come out of these findings. So first, as we mentioned, our results show that eviction prevention is an economic and racial justice issue. And of course, we find that 60% of filings are located in Ward 7 and 8, suggesting just how disproportionately the eviction process impacts low-income DC residents and renters of color. And we should think about targeting aid to these populations, making sure that resources and information are available right in the communities that need them. We also argue that landlord-side interventions provide an important stopgap measure before an eviction is filed. So while we typically talk about interventions that target tenants, in this report, we're also strongly advocating for solutions that target landlords. And as we've shown, it's just a small number of landlords who are responsible for a really large number of findings. If we could theoretically pull these 20 landlords into a room and just have a conversation, we think perhaps really interesting things could happen. Access to legal counsel helps to level the playing field for tenants facing eviction. Landlords almost always have counsel, tenants almost never do. This is shown to be the case in other cities as well. We have more work to do to help tenants secure access to legal counsel. Record sealing is essential for mitigating eviction stigma and preventing harm to tenants. The council has taken some really important steps to begin talking about record sealing. We think that DC could be one of the most progressive cities in the country by taking this bill a step further to immediately seal eviction filings. And we look forward to talking more with the council about this. Emergency rental assistance can serve as a tool of eviction prevention. So ERAP and other kinds of programs, especially in the COVID era that are now available to tenants, these are really essential to keep renters out of court. What we want to emphasize is that the earlier we can make these tools and resources available to tenants, and the more frequently, the better. So tenants need to be able to access funds more than once a year, since we know that the majority of tenants who have one filing have at least one more. Ultimately, though, if we want to solve the eviction crisis, we need to solve the affordable housing crisis. To this end, we think that long-term subsidized housing is the most effective tool to combat housing instability. Thank you so much. We look forward to turning over turning the conversation over to the panel, and I'll just introduce our moderator, Adrian Todman, who will take it from here.
Great. Thank you so much, Eva, and thank you, Brian, for that really compelling summary of your report. And also thank you to Chris Murphy and for Georgetown University for inviting me to moderate this session with this esteemed panel. Before I jump in and introducing the panel, I want to just spend a couple of seconds just placing this report into the larger national context right now. We know that the space to talk about eviction was in many ways created by some of our colleagues, Matthew Desmond with his Pulitzer Prize winning book, Evicted, some time ago, which really created an amazing national dialogue about what's the real impact of eviction on families. Certainly that. Move forward quickly to where we are now, where it has, notwithstanding the timing of this report, we are in the middle of a pandemic that has really challenged our ability to look at what's happening inside of renters right now. According to the Urban Institute, there are 5 million renter households who are experiencing joblessness. And just a few weeks ago, that number was upwards of just over 8 million. Last month, we saw that the federal government, via the CDC, issued a eviction moratorium, which slowed the process and halted actual evictions until next year. So there's this eviction cliff that we know is coming in the next several months. But we have the other side of the coin. We have many landlords themselves who are facing their own financial impact. And by them not receiving rent, it's impacting their ability to pay their mortgages and deal with their debt and potentially even maintaining their units. And we know that of the 48 million rental units across the country, roughly 20 million of them are operated and owned by smaller, we call them mom and pop landlords. So it's in that current environment that this report enters. And let me introduce our amazing panelists, many of whom I'm happy to call past colleagues, who's going to talk a little bit and tease some of this out with me. We have Polly Donaldson, who, of course, is the director of DC's Department of Housing and Community Development since 2015. We have Ashley Hahn, who is a real estate attorney who counsels investors and owners here in the Washington area. We have Randy Marshall, who is the Vice President of Government Affairs at AOBA, the Apartment and Office Building Association. And we have Beth Mellon, who is the Supervising Attorney in the Housing Law Unit at the Legal Aid Society here in DC, and also the Director of the Legal Aid Eviction Defense Project. Their more extensive bios you can find and a link in the chat box. I'm not doing them justice with the brevity of that. But I'm going to ask Polly, Ashley, Randy, and Beth to just share just 2 minutes or so on what's your walkway on this report and what's something you want the folks who are listening and watching us today know. And I'll start with you, Beth.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. It's great to be here this morning to talk about such an important topic. I just have 3 takeaways I want to share. One, as has been discussed by Brian and Eva, eviction really reflects deep racial disparities that we know are historic in income and wealth and access to housing, but it also deepens them. And so, Adrian, you mentioned Matthew Desmond's book, and one of his big theses is that eviction is a cause, not just a condition of poverty, for the reasons that Brian talked about at the very beginning. Number 2, families with extremely low income are struggling to pay their rent, tens of thousands of those families in the district every single month, including those who receive subsidies. And so when we talk about eviction, the affordable housing crisis, we really need to talk about income and wealth as well. It's a much deeper issue. And we need to ask, why are so many families making so little money in such a high cost region? And then third, I would say, despite really strong tenant protections in the district, including the chairman talked about emergency protections that have been put in place, tenants face incredible odds in the eviction crisis and the affordable housing crisis, the deck that is stacked against them. And so many low-income families are dealing with extremely challenging financial circumstances. And then when they go into court, as Eva mentioned, they are facing a dramatic power imbalance where 90% of landlords have attorneys, only about 10% of tenants do. And so despite those robust legal protections, tenants do not get just outcomes. And that's something we need to talk about. And that really goes back to, we need to fix the eviction process. We need to look at those issues, but we need to look at the underlying causes, the economic disparities and racial disparities.
Thank you, Beth. Randy, it looks like you have something to say about that. What are your thoughts about the report?
So thank you so much. And I'm very pleased to be invited to speak about this important topic. One of my main focus, kind of taking away, was the whole ecosystem around evictions that exist. We know that in order for a housing provider to regain possession of their property and to ensure payment, that they have to go through the eviction process. Unfortunately, this is an inherently contentious and unbalanced process, but ultimately it gets back to how are we able to gain access to some of the broader issues that the report struck. Housing providers and tenants want to gain access to rental assistance, to mediation. They want to have access to the payment plans, the court-ordered payment plans, and even court-ordered repairs and maintenance. And all of this kind of exists after you file an eviction. And it might actually incentivize housing providers and tenants even to kind of go along with the process if they know that they need a writ in order to gain rental assistance. And so I really want to try to focus on how can we circumvent the eviction process in order to get to the underlying help for both housing providers and tenants, because we realize it's not really about trying to remove someone from their home. It's about ensuring the authority and enforcement of a contract and making sure that they try to get payment.
Thank you very much, Randy, for that. And Ashley, your thoughts?
Hi, so I began my career a decade ago representing landlords in DC Superior Court and later broadened my practice to represent in the purchase and sale and financing of apartment buildings. And from that perspective, I 100% agree with the report's conclusion that the city should allocate resources towards the availability of counsel for tenants. I think tenants that have access to counsel have a way to address disparities that exist in bargaining power in pending eviction cases. And this need is critical when you consider how negatively an eviction action can impact a district resident. Where I didn't agree with the report was the conclusion that the city should focus its policies on frustrating the eviction process for larger landlords. It wasn't clear to me in the background data for that conclusion what percentage of those units were actually public housing units for which the housing authorities were covering possession. In those cases, we obviously wouldn't want to have policies that interfere with their ability to recover the tenant from a tenant not doing what they're supposed to do, so that the housing authority can then make the unit available to other tenants on their lengthy wait list. Similarly, if you are an investor in affordable properties in the city, they're historically and typically located in underserved areas of the city. Those buildings often have income restrictions which govern who the units can be rented to, which can be set at anywhere from 80 to 50% of area median income. It's necessarily the case that those tenants will face a higher rate of non-payment because they're designed to serve as a housing resource for tenants suffering an economic disparity. I don't think it's a good idea to craft a policy based on raw numbers based simply on landlord size, because I think by doing that, you can create a serious ripple effect that would disincentivize investment in affordable units, which is something the city both sorely needs to preserve.
Thank you very much, Ashley. And Madam Director, Polly Donaldson, your thoughts?
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to the McCourt School. I very much appreciate being invited to participate. I have two takeaways, although I absolutely concur with Beth Mellon's first point regarding racial and economic disparity being absolute causes of our eviction crisis, both prior to COVID and even more so now. And that I think looking at approaches that address equity in not just economic development, but also in housing across the district is absolutely critical. My two takeaways, though, from the report: continued production and preservation of affordable housing is essential from a absolute macro level. And that is what we do at the Department of Housing and Community Development. And we've been able, actually, even during the state of emergency as declared by Mayor Bowser in March, we have actually closed over 15 projects with $54 million of Housing Production Trust Fund dollars. So we are continuing to produce that affordable housing, which is absolutely critical to helping to address the supply issue of affordable housing. Second, though, and I think this is absolutely critical, and the report goes into this in a very clear way, we have stepped up rental assistance programs in addition to the emergency rent, the existing locally funded emergency rental assistance program, ERAP. And we're doing this via an interagency working group where DHCD, which has federal resources from the CARES Act for rent assistance, and is implementing a couple of versions of that, one that focuses on helping small buildings and landlords in small buildings and tenants in small buildings maintain that housing, as well as our coronavirus housing assistance program known as CHAP, which also provides rent assistance. And again, we're coordinating with the ERAP program. So it's a single point of entry. It's a streamlined process. We're working with the same community-based organizations to implement. But the bottom line about additional federal assistance needed is absolutely critical. And maybe that's my third takeaway, actually. But we can go into that a little more, but that is absolutely critical and will be for when the surge or the cliff or whatever metaphor you want to use, it's coming. We know it is once the eviction moratorium has passed. What we're doing now is putting in place a system that's going to be able to address that, but we'll need more resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Polly. Thank you. We'll come back to the role that the oversized role the federal government has to play in this. Beth, let me challenge you a little bit on this. So, my memory is that DC was considered, probably still is considered, one of the most tenant-friendly localities in the country. You and I both know how difficult it's been bring in some landlords to the table, particularly landlords, to participate in some government programs. Do you feel in any way that by putting some of these policies in place, we are not incentivizing and not perhaps disincentive to landlords continuing to provide housing here in DC where so many people need it? I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, Adrienne, I think it's an interesting question because overall, DC has such a robust and frankly inflationary speculative real estate market that I don't think landlords are going to be disincentivized from investing. We definitely need programs to focus on affordable housing, and the council needs to fund it the right way. And so, for example, the Housing Production Trust Fund, historically, although it's done better in recent years, has not met its goals for housing at the lowest affordability level where families are struggling the most or most severely rent burdened. And so certainly we need to make sure that the council puts in place the appropriate deep subsidized funding that goes with the production money to preserve and produce affordable units, especially units that are affordable to folks at the lowest income levels in the district. And right now that target is 50%. And so I would think about it in terms of, I like Randy's use of the term ecosystem because we have a lot of ecosystems in play here, and the affordable housing ecosystem needs to be well resourced and supported so that the affordable housing developers have the incentives to work in that system to be able to produce and preserve those units. That may be a little bit different than the question you're asking, but that's how I think about incentives. But I think in general, landlords and owners have many, many incentives to invest in the district, which is why we see them continuing to do so in the private market. And I don't think any of these policies that we should be concerned about some overall effect that's going to, slow down the real estate market. Quite the opposite in the district, even right now during COVID.
Thank you. Ashley and Randy, are you hearing concerns from your clients and members? Either one of you, jump in.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that we're noticing, Beth mentioned that there is a desire for housing providers to be in the district and to provide housing to the range of renters that exist in the city. One of the things that we're trying to incentivize, though, is affordable housing providers, which is a completely different ecosystem than we're talking about luxury or even moderately priced housing. With the affordable housing kind of sphere, we're seeing there's a lot of restrictions. There's a lot of requirements, there's a lot of regulations, administrative processes that exist that don't exist in the private market-based system, which can really frustrate someone who doesn't, a housing provider that doesn't have the resources or the capacity to do all the compliance and vetting that's required to be compliant with not only federal, but district regulations. And if we want to incentivize folks to participate in affordable housing, these are the types of things we have to make it easy for them. And I think this is an opportunity to talk about how to make it easy for housing providers, sure, big and small.
Right. And Ashley, let me change it up a little bit. And let me say, we're going to be turning to you all for your questions. So please put your questions into the Q&A box. I see there's some in there now, but we'll be turning to you in a little bit. Ashley, so the report did speak to the tactic of landlords very quickly doing a notice to evict when rent was just, let's say, barely late. Do you think that there is room for landlords to see that there's some negotiation, some conversations to have with renters so that it doesn't feel like such an antagonistic relationship?
I think what I've observed is landlords that have been through the eviction process understand that when a tenant contests an eviction, sometimes it can take several months and at times over a year for the case to be resolved. And typically when those cases are pending, the landlord's not receiving rent for the unit. And I think what happens is over time, landlords come to this natural conclusion that the best way to protect their position is to file early, because they understand if there's going to be a dispute that they could be in that dispute for a very long time. I understand the conclusion about increasing a filing fee and the correlation to that to the rate of cases. To me, though, I don't know that that's really going to be an effective tool. Obviously, you also wouldn't want to increase a filing fee that may potentially be passed through to a tenant. One of the things the council's done recently is they've eliminated the ability to waive. They've eliminated what used to be a waiver of a right to receive a 30-day notice to quit. So now if a landlord wants to pursue an eviction, once the moratorium lifts, they'll have to issue that 30-day notice. It's possible that 30-day notice period may serve as an opportunity for landlords and tenants to have a discussion and to enter into payment plans. And if that's the case, that would be a very good result. I think. And
Ashley, are you finding that because of the moratorium, both the local one and the federal one, are you finding that landlords are now learning a new muscle memory, that they are coming together with their tenants and figuring out how to make this work?
Well, actually, the largest amount of comments I've gotten back have been that because of the way the payment plan legislation is crafted, a lot of tenants actually don't want to discuss a payment plan until they know that we're at the end of the moratorium, so that way they know their total balance and they know what their payments are. Landlords and tenants are trying to work together so that landlords can really receive at least some rent. But the reality is these balances are continuing to climb. And so I don't know that it's been as effective as folks had hoped at the initial outset, simply because a lot of tenants don't want to have these discussions till they know what they owe. What I think the district needs to focus on is making rent relief available to tenants to deal with these balances, because they're going to get out of control, and it's going to create a cascade effect of multitudes of cases being filed.
Thank you. Yeah, yes.
If I could, please, I actually, let me follow from what Ashley was just saying.
Thank you, Polly.
In fact, we have stepped up rent relief programs, rent assistance programs, but also have very much streamlined them in a way. For example, a writ is not required anymore in order to receive emergency rent assistance, ERAP. In addition, the CHAP program, you can come back several times. I mean, it's not, there's a cap on the overall amount, but you can pay now and then come back 3 months later if there is still the need, and be able to apply again up to 6 months of relief. So these programs are in place. Again, we need additional resources. I will also say several landlords, large and small, have reached out to us and are actively working with their tenants to help them with the application process. It's all being done virtual, and there's some scanning of documents that's required. And there are ways and there are examples of where landlords have stepped up and said, let's let our property management office work with you, where they've put up notices about the rent assistance programs, where they're really trying, I think, to reach out in that way. It's not, I think, pervasive throughout the entire system. I think it should be. To me, it benefits the landlord as well. And this is, again, while we await, not only the district being made whole, we were shorted $750 million from the state and local aid in the first CARES Act, but also the additional national rent assistance that we know is going to be essential and needs to be part of the next COVID-19 relief bill.
Yes.
I'm sorry, can I jump in just real quick on these COVID issues, just to provide, another perspective, and not just, everything that Polly is saying is true of some landlords, certainly. We have seen a significant increase in tenants calling us about illegal behavior by landlords because of the eviction moratorium. So locking out tenants, cutting off utilities, threatening and harassing tenants, saying things like, I want you to leave, and if you don't leave, I'm just going to start showing the unit to, tenants and having folks come in during a pandemic. And we also, there was a Washington City paper article about certain owners and property managers who got federal PPP loans, which are essentially grants, and didn't pass on any of those benefits to tenants, nor are they required to do so. Whereas there were some landlords, right, who did the right thing, I would say, and got that kind of benefit because they weren't getting the same rental income, and then cut rents for tenants as a result. And so I just want to make sure we have a complete picture this morning that, sure, there are landlords who are working with tenants, and do in normal times as well, but there also are landlords who abuse the system. And that's part of what we see every day when tenants reach out to us.
And indeed, that is where DHCD does have a regulatory role as well, meaning that that's what our rent administration does, field those complaints and acts on them.
Yeah, and I think, and Randy, I think you've coined a nice way to look at this, which is it's an ecosystem. And we have good players, we have bad players, probably on both sides. But the idea is, how do we help families with their housing insecurity, but also, help landlords with the bills that they have to pay and their obligations. And Polly, you've mentioned the work the city is doing in terms of rental assistance. Do you have enough? I mean, I'm throwing a softball to you. Is there enough? And what do we need from the federal government at this point?
Well, clearly, we have actually, if you include FY20, ERAP, and FY21, as well as the CARES Act federal funding, all told, we've got a little over 35 million all told in various forms of rent assistance. It's not going to be enough for when the surge occurs. We know that. We know that there will be attempts, but really, given our local resource situation, we know it needs to be additional federal resources. And my message is basically, we have the system and the processes in place. We're fine-tuning them. We're being even more efficient in coordinating across agencies at our local level. But really, we need the federal government to step up with the resources to help supplement what it is that we are doing locally. And that also includes, though, for landlords, mortgage assistance or mortgage forgiveness. And indeed, there is some of that going on specifically with the federal, with FHA loans, and our housing finance agency is working with the affordable housing providers as well on that, but more is needed.
Thank you, Polly. We're now going to shift to questions that our viewers have, and I will invite Brian and Eva back to the virtual table here to help out. And Polly, I'll start with you as a question. One question is, on the eviction cliff and long-term effects of pandemic of renters, are landlords in DC able to seek back rent from tenants evicted for non-payment? And this actually may be Polly, but perhaps Beth and Ashley as well.
Yeah.
Are landlords in DC able to seek back rent?
Absolutely. Rent arrears is what the programs are providing funding for. So it is related to that, and especially related to COVID. That's what or economic distress caused by COVID, which has made tenants unable to pay rent. I don't know if it's specifically, but maybe Beth could answer that about the, when evicted, still being able to procure back rent.
So once a tenant's evicted, most eviction cases are for possession. And, if the eviction happens, there may or may not be an order in that case for the tenant to pay money, but they do under the law still owe it. And I want to circle back to something that Eva and Brian have talked about, which is the harm that an eviction case on your record has, and that there's the harm to credit history and so forth. And again, that's an issue we see every day. We have a case manager who helps folks look for housing. It's one of the biggest barriers folks encounter. And so even if that tenant doesn't ever have to pay back that money, the record of that case follows them. The harm to their credit follows them if they leave owing money.
Right. There's a great question here about, in order to support this idea that landlords and tenants can be more proactive to find a way to address non-payment of rent before filing an eviction notice, who needs to be in the room to figure that out? Who are the stakeholders to get the conversation started, and we can get to that end? Who needs to be in the room, Randy?
Jump in just to say, and I appreciate everything Polly has said about there have been improvements during COVID to access to rental assistance. We think we can do more to decrease barriers. And the council has passed emergency legislation that should be made permanent in terms of lowering documentation requirements and so forth. That makes the process more efficient. But I think we also should think about what low-income tenants are forced to go through in that process, which can be a very stressful and even humiliating process to have to prove they are somehow deserving of help when they are facing a crisis and about to lose their homes.
Thank you, Beth.
Point made, Beth.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I got it. So, Randy, if you could, who needs to be in the room? Who are the stakeholders that need to be at the table to try to find a way to prevent eviction violence to begin with?
Housing providers need to be in the room, obviously. We want folks to be in the room, particularly those who serve economically disadvantaged populations. And that's something that Eva spoke about. She spoke about how affordable housing providers and how, they may serve a particular population and may experience, having to file evictions more frequently. And so we want to make sure that those folks who have an understanding of the process and understanding, of what are the needs, particularly the desire to make sure that payment is made and not just we want to get you out. If the eviction in itself is an extremely expensive process, long process to go through. And housing providers would love to avoid it. What they want is they want to be able to work with the tenants that they have in place to receive payment and for them to stay in place. And hopefully, if we can have a discussion with tenants and housing providers and all of the ecosystem that exists to try to figure this out before an eviction filing occurs and to actually try to prevent evictions, I think that would be the best case scenario.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Randy. Eva, during your presentation at Kojo Show, I think it was last week, on this issue, there are a fair number of landlords who called in just really concerned about what the report was saying and their obligations. You want to talk a little bit more about what your message is to them and ways that this report can actually maybe strengthen their relationship in the rental market?
Sure. So, and I think this is related to what we're just talking about with this emphasis on trying to have a conversation informally, whether that's with the help of a third party or without the help of a third party, but trying to treat each other, tenants and landlords, like human beings who both have needs, and to have that informal conversation before things get to the court. That being said, I think there's a problem here in the sense that if the root cause is an affordability problem, you can talk and you can mediate and you can have these informal conversations all you want, but at the end of the day, the tenant may not have the money to pay. And so we really do need to think about other solutions. And Brian and I talked about how we think, providing more subsidized housing subsidies is incredibly important. And short of that, because I think at least right now there's not a ton of political will for that, we do need to talk seriously about record sealing, because as Beth pointed out, this is really the number one thing, and it harkens back to Matt Desmond's work and this cycle of eviction stigma, where once you have that mark on your record, whether it's a filing or an executed eviction, it really damages tenants in the long term. And so, yes, landlords need to get paid. Where does that money come from? That's maybe what we should be talking about.
And Beth, you work with these families, and I know you do. I've seen you do it firsthand, who are facing eviction. What's happening to them? What's going through their minds? How is this really hurting families who live in DC?
So there is so much fear and stress about loss of one's home, right? Our home is the place we want to go to and be safe. And many of these families, we should also note, are living with terrible housing conditions already, are living with other challenges in their homes. And so tenants need support. You know, as I mentioned, we need a process that is as stress-free and is respectful and gives dignity to these tenants. And unfortunately, the court process is not like that for them. It is the opposite. And so taking down barriers to rental assistance, making sure that tenants' voices are heard, designing a court process that allows tenants' voices to be heard. Tenants should not have to have access to a lawyer to be able to have a fair outcome in an eviction case, but unfortunately, that is the case. And so I think there's a lot that we need to do, but ultimately coming back to the economic inequality, the lack of money, that's the underlying issue, is the lack of affordable housing, the lack of sufficient income and wealth for so many families in the district.
Brian, you've been quiet. Yeah, go right ahead.
I just wanted to add, in terms of what we're doing with the rent assistance at this point, it is pretty clear that, that having those in place, having the waivers in place that HUD has given us to be more flexible with the program has been absolutely critical, and that we need to see those extended, I think, particularly allowing some programs to both pay rent arrears and forward rent, like the tenant-based rent assistance program that's home funded by HUD, but then also looking at the COVID-related assistance, which is basically extended what CDBG, Community Development Block Grants, can pay from 3 months to 6 months of rent arrears. That kind of flexibility, being able to turn on a dime in that way and pivot and really make these resources available, not just in times of crisis, but also looking at it in an ongoing way, and really, again, relying on the structures that are in place that allow, municipalities like the district to be able to move swiftly, both in emergency and in regular order.
Right. We're getting close to closing now, but Brian, I wanted to have you jump in here a little bit. You've heard what the panelists have to say. Is there any particular point you want to make in response?
Yeah, no, I mean, this has been a really terrific discussion to be part of and to hear. I think that one thing that our report does in sort of moving forward as a researcher and somebody on the data side of this is to think about the importance of kind of good, high quality available data for pushing these conversations. And so I'm really grateful to our colleagues at the court system who have been incredibly helpful in providing data that sort of informed this conversation. And I hope that kind of one of the broader outcomes is that we're able to continue to develop these partnerships. Eva and I are in discussion with a number of other agencies and a number of other programs about accessing data that would help us understand the ERAP program better, right? And help us to understand the rapid rehousing program better, to help us understand affordable housing subsidies and sort of where they're going, and the voucher program. And so I think my sort of wrap-up call would be to simply say that this kind of analysis is really possible, and it sounds like it's really useful when the data is available for researchers like me and Eva, and then that's put in conversation with everybody on this panel. So I would sort of wrap up my portion of the comments by just sort of a plea to know that sort of researchers like us can continue to do this work in conversation with policy as that data is made available.
Yeah, and I think that's just right. I think we do need the kind of rigorous research that both you and Eva did, so that we can move the conversation forward, and we can look at this ecosystem, as Randy so eloquently has framed this, to create a stronger rental experience, not just for the families, but also for the landlords. Polly, if there are families who are out there who I can't stress it enough, who listening to this, who need help, what should they do?
They need to look at the coronavirus.dc.gov website where we list all of the rent assistance programs and the access points. In addition, even easier, they can call 311 and they'll be referred to the housing agency that can help them get rent assistance. It's available now. I encourage people to apply for it now. It's there for you. Thank you.
Okay. So this is a rapid answer round for each one of you. Just one word. Where do you hope we are a year from now in this conversation? Maybe 2 words. And Eva, I'll start with you.
Sorry, I had to unmute. I hope that we are. I hope we have more money for tenants.
There you go, Brian.
I hope that we have more data to understand processes.
Great, Ashley.
I hope we've developed a better process in that 30-day period before we file an eviction case to negotiate and develop a resolution of the case so that eviction isn't filed.
Great, Randy.
I hope for a balanced outcome where housing providers can keep their properties and tenants can keep their homes.
Great. Polly?
I'd like to see robust federal infrastructure programs, including housing.
Great. And Beth?
We are doing the hard work to achieve what Mayor Bowser has said of coming out of COVID with a more equitable and inclusive District of Columbia, recognizing that our budget and our laws are moral statements about how we will treat residents of the district.
You're here.
Well said. Well said, all of you. Chris, I turn it back to you. Thank you all for not just your words, but also the passion of what you do. I live here in DC. It's been my home for a long time. I know all of you, and I know that this conversation will lead to further that, again, will just make this wonderful home of ours much better. Chris, I turn the microphone back to you.
Adrian, thank you so much. If the folks on the Zoom are like me, your head is swimming with just so much information and so much thought, and what a fantastic conversation. So let me just thank all of today's speakers. Adrian, let me thank you for the excellent job moderating. I also want to thank the great team at Georgetown who put this event together, especially Heidi Sue, Jeff Bible, and Sue Telecat. And most of all, I want to thank all of you who joined us today, the 400 plus of you who joined us for this really important conversation. Clearly, we have more work to do here, and we hope that this report and the data-driven nature of its analysis will help inform future efforts and conversations to prevent evictions in DC. Thank you all. Have a good rest of the day.